Hey, welcome everybody. This is the last class that we're going to have on the subject of just mercy, justice, and the people of God. I hope you've enjoyed this class. I hope it's been eye-opening for you as much as it has been for me, and I hope it has blessed you, and that it'll give you a deeper insight into what doing righteousness and justice mean, especially for us as God's people. Let me start with just a question. I don't know if are you aware of any other of the creation stories that exist apart from the Judeo-Christian creation story? I mean, there are a bunch of them, and most of them are accounts of a creation as the result of a battle or of a struggle between warring cosmic forces. For instance, the Chinese account has the primordial giant Pangu emerged from the ancient cosmic egg, and when he died, the parts of his body became the world. His eyes were the sun and the moon, his body, the mountains, his blood, the waters, his muscles, the land, his beard, the forests. There's an African story that says a giant gets sick and vomited out the world, the sun, the moon, the stars, and the vegetation and human beings. Norse mythology, says the god Odin killed the giant Ymir and used his body to create the universe and its inhabitants. There's a Babylonian account that's similar, that tells the story of the god Marduk, who defeats the ocean goddess Tiamat and produces the world out of her members. In most ancient creation stories, the visible universe comes about as a result of conflict, of powers that are in tension with one another. The biblical account, and we're going to be talking about peace and justice in this last class. The biblical account is really very different. In the biblical account, our unrivaled God acts. He creates. He acts like a craftsman or an artist or an artisan, and he takes chaos, and out of that he creates water. So rather than having the cosmos created by conflict, the Judeo-Christian view of creation sees our unrivaled God taking chaos and creating order. Sometimes the imagery that's used to describe the creation is architectural. For instance, when in Job 38, when God finally answers Job and begins to ask him a series of questions to kind of bring him up short, he says, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" And I did a foundation of a building. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it, or on what were its footing set, or who laid its cornerstone? So the imagery here is like a builder who takes a pile of raw materials and rightly relates them to one another to form a house. God brings order out of chaos. Sometimes the Bible describes the creation as a weaver, an artisan weaving a garment. And we're not going to look at all of these, but I'll tell you that Psalm 104 verse 6 and in Job 38, Psalm 104, Psalm 102, the sea, the clouds, the lights of the sky, all the forces of nature are called garments that are woven and worn by God. And woven cloth consists of, think about this, it consists of innumerable threads that are all interlaced with one another. And so it's a very apt metaphor for the wonder and the character of the material world. God turned a chaos into a cosmos, and he also turned a tangle into a tapestry. And so God creates everything, and he creates it all to be in a beautiful, harmonious, interdependent, knitted, webbed relationship with one another. And just as rightly related physical elements form a cosmos or a tapestry, so rightly related human beings form a community. Now, the point is this interwovenness, this connectedness is what the Bible calls shalom, or harmonious peace. Now, shalom is usually just translated peace in our English Bibles, but it means so much more than what the English word conveys. It refers to a complete reconciliation of all creation, a state of the fullest flourishing in every dimension, whether you're talking about the ecology or humanity, every single bit of it is flourishing to its fullest. And there are forms of shalom. One is physical shalom. When your body's working the way it should, all of your organs and everything's working in sync with each other, and they're in unity with one another, so you have what is called physical shalom. When you're injured or you have a disease, parts of your body may be out of alignment with the others, or maybe rebelling against the others, so to speak. So when parts of your body fail to work interdependently, you're experiencing a loss of physical shalom or well-being. There is emotional shalom. When all of your inner faculties, you experience a period of mental well-being, your emotions and your conscience and everything else is in sync. All of your inner faculties are working together. That's emotional or even psychological shalom. But when you experience things like guilt and anxiety, you lose emotional shalom or peace. And then there's also, and especially for our discussion, there is social shalom. I'm sure all of you have seen many times the Frank Capra's movie "It's a Wonderful Life." Jimmy Stewart plays a George Bailey, who's whose family runs a savings and loan company in a small town, and over the years they help people get in the town get mortgages with fair and reasonable rates, and they've been patient and they've been caring when loans couldn't be repaid, and they've tried to help them do as much as they could. And as the CEO of this company, George's bottom line was not that he was maximizing profits, but he was helping his community flourish and helping his customers flourish. So as you can imagine, George did not get rich in this process with this kind of approach. But at one point in the movie, and I won't go into it, but he's suicidal, and he is given a vision of this small town that he lives in, what it would look like if, as he was wishing at the moment, he had never been born. And the angel comes and shows him his community. What he sees is a community that consists of some wealthy families surrounded by an impoverished and dysfunctional town. Instead of a kindly neighbors, there are brutal and self-interested parties in constant conflict with one another. And so the point is that without George Bailey's efforts, the town had lost its social shalom. And to the Jews, when society disintegrates and when there is crime and poverty and family breakdown, there is no shalom. But when people share their resources with each other, and they work together so that shared public services work, so that the environment is safe and beautiful, so the schools educate and businesses flourish, then that community is experiencing social shalom. When people with more advantages invest themselves in those who have fewer advantages, the community experiences civic prosperity or social shalom. Now, generally, our world doesn't operate that way, right? It's interesting. Before sin entered the world, there was absolute shalom. Humanity walked with God, served him under his rule and authority. It was paradise. That's shalom in Jewish thought. That's shalom. Everything, humanity, creation, everything was in harmony. But humanity turned away from God, and sin entered into the world to deface and mar everything that God had made, creation, humanity, and we became estranged from God. Not only that, but we became alienated from our true selves and also from one another. And our self-absorption has led to profound social evil in our world, to war and crime, to family breakdown, oppression, and injustice. When we lost sight of our relationship with God, the whole world stopped working right the way it was supposed to. And so the world is filled with hunger and sickness and aging and physical death. And because our relationship with God is broken down, shalom is gone. Spiritual, psychological, social, physical, it's all gone. Now, for weeks, this is the 7th week that we've been talking about doing justice. And in general, doing justice is trying to help God undo what sin did in the world. In general, to do justice means to live in a way that generates a strong community where human beings can flourish. You know, I think we have such a tendency just to think of salvation and our relationship to God as an individual thing and not a communal thing, but it is a communal thing, not only within the church, but within the church's relationship to the world. To do justice then means to go to places where the fabric of shalom has broken down, where the weaker members of society are falling through the fabric, and then we're trying to repair it. We're trying to find where those things are, and in the name of God and of Jesus Christ, we're striving to repair those things. And the only way to kind of reweave and strengthen the fabric of shalom is by weaving ourselves into the story. Timothy Keller, and by the way, this is largely based on his book, Generous Justice. I really encourage you to get it. He goes into much more detail. Such a good writer, and I encourage you to get his book. And he says that human beings are kind of like a bunch of threads that are thrown onto a table. You take a pile of thread and throw it onto a table. Fabric doesn't automatically happen, but it can be woven into fabric. And so he says if we keep our money and our time and our power to ourselves, for ourselves, instead of spending them on our neighbors for their good, then we may literally be on top of one another, but we're not creating this interwoven fabric of shalom that's supposed to exist. We're not socially, relationally, financially, or emotionally interwoven or connected with one another. And reweaving shalom means to sacrificially thread your time and your goods and your power and resources into the lives and needs of others. What it means is disadvantaging yourself for the sake of others. Now, this is the essence of the gospel. This is the essence of the gospel. Jesus did not come to be saved, but to save and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's about disadvantaging yourself, following your master, and disadvantaging yourself for the sake of others. Remember from 2 weeks ago, we talked about Old Testament scholar Dr. Bruce Waltke, who studied all of the appearances of the Hebrew words mishpat, or justice, and righteousness, or justness, or tzedakah, in the Old Testament. This is what he concluded, that in the Bible, the righteous, tzedek, are willing to disadvantage themselves for the sake of the community. The wicked are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. Now, Tim Keller gives a great real world example of this. He references the book Everyone Here Spoke Sign Language by Nora Ellen Gross. Nora Ellen Gross was a Yale professor who, in the 80s, she was researching hereditary deafness on the island of Martha's Vineyard. Now, there's not any hereditary deafness there now, but because of other factors, because people have moved away, there's more mobility. People have intermarried or married people from outside the island. But in the 17th century, the original European settlers were all from the same region in England, and where there was a very high incidence of hereditary deafness. And so they moved. They come to Martha's Vineyard, which is an island. So they're geographically isolated. They begin to intermarry with one another. But because of that, the percentage of deaf people increased across the whole island. By the 19th century, 1 out of every 25 people in the town of Chilmark on the island of Martha's Vineyard was deaf. In another small settlement, almost a quarter of the people couldn't hear. Now, in most societies, physically handicapped people are forced to adapt to the patterns of the non-handicapped. But that's not what happened on Martha's Vineyard. One day, Gross was interviewing an older island resident, and she was doing this again in the 80s. The last time I think they had someone who had hereditary deafness on Martha's Vineyard was maybe 1952, something like this. So she was interviewing an older island resident, and she asked him if it had been necessary for everyone to write things down, so that on paper, so that they could communicate with the deaf folks. And the man responded surprised and said, "No, you see, we all spoke sign language." And she said, "Well, okay, you're talking about the deaf members, family members, the deaf person's family members? He said, oh no, everybody in town. He said, I used to speak it. My mother did. Everybody did. So what had happened was that an entire community, think about this, an entire community had disadvantaged themselves for the sake of a minority. Instead of making the non-hearing minority learn to read lips, the whole hearing majority learned how to sign. And so all their hearing, it all became bilingual. So deaf people were able to enter into full social participation. Now, what Keller says, and I agree with this is part of doing justice. This is they disadvantaged themselves, and because of that, the majority experienced shalom. It included people in the social fabric who in other places would have fallen through it. But they said, no, we're not going to allow that to happen. We're going to make sure that everyone is treated equally, that everyone is together. And so the hearing people disadvantaged themselves for the sake of minority. Now, Martha's Vineyard it's a unique situation, but in every time and in every culture, here's the principle that always holds. The strong must disadvantage themselves for the weak, the majority for the minority, or the community phrase, and the fabric breaks. Now, folks, that's what Jesus has called us to do. That's what God calls us to do. I think the only way we can do that is to somehow see God in the face of the poor and the disadvantaged, the vulnerable. I should have used more than just the poor. But look at these two verses. Proverbs 19:17 says, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. Proverbs 14:31 says, whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Now, you need to think about those two. We need to think about those two verses. What are they saying? Well, Proverbs 19:17 is saying that showing kindness to the poor is kindness to God. Kindness to the vulnerable is kindness to God. And Proverbs 14:31 is kind of the flip side. To insult the poor or the vulnerable is to insult God. Well, what are you talking about, David? Well, I think someone in class last week mentioned redlining. Redlining is where banks refuse to give mortgages and small business loans to people in poor and non-white communities and neighborhoods because statistically they're less likely to make good on the loans. So they just don't issue any loans. God, however, says that we're not to live in that way in our relationships with the poor and the vulnerable. In effect, in Proverbs 19:17, he's saying, don't redline people. Don't look at someone and say, listen, if I get involved in the life of that person, I might be taken advantage of. He says, don't say that. He says, I see a gift to the poor as a gift to me, and I will in some way, I'll make the loan good. I'll give you value if you'll just trust me. That's what Proverbs 19 verse 17 is saying. Now, in your life, you already have probably family members, friends, or neighbors who have chronic problems, and they're just difficult to love. They're just difficult to love. And in our community, there are even more people like that. Chronic problems. And they're so hard to love. And what God is saying in Proverbs 19:17 is don't shrink back from spending yourself on the broken and the hurting and the needy and the vulnerable. I'm good for it. But there's a deeper principle at work here. As I said, to insult the poor is to insult God. The principle is that God personally identifies very closely with the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, even the illegal immigrant, the most powerless and vulnerable members of society. And in Proverbs, we see God identifying with the poor symbolically. But I want you to understand that in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, we see God identifying with the poor and marginal literally. Now think about this. Jesus is the king of the universe. When he was born, they put him in a feed trough. Here, king, get in the feed trough. When his parents had him circumcised, the offering that they made was 2 pigeons. And I don't know if you know this or not, but that was prescribed for the poorest class of people in society because they couldn't afford anything else. Jesus lived among poor and marginalized people. They were drawn to him even as the respectable people were repulsed by him. We see the kind of life he lived in Luke 9, verse 58, when he says, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. I mean, Jesus essentially was homeless. He, at the end of his life, he rode into Jerusalem, and this is Palm Sunday. This is when we celebrate that. He rode into Jerusalem on a borrowed donkey. He spent his last evening in a borrowed room, and when he died, he was laid in a borrowed tomb. He died naked and penniless. He was discarded. He was thrown away. But it's only because of him that we have hope. And Jesus Christ, God identified not only with the poor, but also with those who were denied justice. I know if you go back to John 18 and the trial that Jesus had before the Sanhedrin, you can see all the ways that this trial was a miscarriage of justice. There was no public notification of this was all required by the law. There was no public notification of the trial. It was held in the middle of the night, which wasn't supposed to happen. Jesus was allowed no defense. He was forcibly struck in the middle of the trial. All of this stuff was against Jewish law. Later on, the colonial governor, Pontius Pilate, knew that the case was insufficient and wanted to throw it out, but he caved to political pressure. Finally, Jesus is tortured cruelly and put to death. And in all these ways, Jesus identifies with the millions of nameless people who have been wrongly imprisoned, robbed of their possessions, tortured, and slaughtered. Now, I say that to say this. There are a lot of people who say, I can't believe in God who would allow the kind of injustice that exists in our world. But here's Jesus, the one and only Son of God, God made flesh, who knows what it's like to be the victim of injustice. He knows what it's like to stand up to power. He knows what it is to face a corrupt system and then to be killed by it. He knows what it is like to be lynched. John R.W. Stott, because of all of that, John R.W. Stott, the great theologian, passed on several years ago. He said, I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who is immune to it? The cross shows us how far God is willing to go to identify with the vulnerable of the world. And he's doing all that for us. The cross is the ultimate instance of God's identification with the poor. He not only was actually poor and marginalized himself, he stood in the place of all those of us who are in spiritual poverty and bankruptcy, and he paid our debt. And my point is simply this. To take that into the center of your life, that knowledge, to truly take that into the center of your life will make you, force you, require you to live a just life, the way the Bible defines it. The God of the Bible says, as it were, I am the poor on your step. Your attitude toward them reveals your true attitude towards me. God says, I am the vulnerable. That's right there at your doorstep, in your neighborhood, in your city, in your nation. And your attitude towards them shows what your attitude towards me is. I want to continue to try to live a just life. Because I think a life poured out in doing justice for the vulnerable is the inevitable sign of any real, true gospel faith. And I hope you've seen that as well in this study. It's a challenge, isn't it? a challenge to live the way God has called it. It's so easy to talk about. It's so easy to teach a class, but it's not easy to actually do it. But I pray we'll all find better ways to actually truthfully reach out and help the vulnerable and do justice in our culture. God bless you.